Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Spain and the southern rim of the EU was devastated by the 2008 economic crash and the EU-dictated austerity response. Its political class suffered severe losses too, and the surge of anti-orthodoxy political forces is a result of that.
Spain faces existential threats too, particularly in Catalonia, where the rise of the separatist cause challenges the very existence of Spain as we have known it for centuries.
But has the anti-orthodoxy force Podemos run out of steam? And if it has, what will that mean for the politics of Spain? Viva Espana or adios? Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Daniel Briggs of the European University of Madrid. Dr. Briggs, thanks for coming from Madrid for the show. Just sketch out for the viewer, will you, what the political horizon looks like in Spain today?
Well, first of all, I think we have to relate what's going on in Spain with wider problems with what is Western democracy across Europe. Most European countries and the United States are experiencing this crisis in what is politics as a result of being totally subservient to global capitalism. At the moment, the landscape is pretty bleak, given that the left is in complete tatters, having gone from being something which was fairly powerful in the early 80s, retaining 40% of the vote, to now the Socialist Party, I think, is getting a bit over 20% of vote.
What's the Socialist Party now? Is that the Labour equivalent? And did it take the Tony Blair New Labour course? And is that one of the reasons why it's sunk?
It's precisely taken a very similar route. In the early 80s, it was grounded in developing workers' rights, unions, and as Spain has gradually opened its doors to foreign investment and corporations, that has disappeared very slowly and was exaggerated by the 2007 crisis, which was botched by the Socialist Party.
And they've paid a big price for that.
Totally.
Just as a slight digression, I was a political activist, I'm sorry to say, when Franco was still in power, when fascism still ruled in Spain. And then the Communist Party was a mighty organisation. It was the resistance to fascism. It had a mass trade union base, albeit an unofficial one, workers' committees, Comisión Obrera, I think they were called. Have they disappeared also?
They moulded into what became Podemos in 2014, which came about as the 15M movement, or the 15M, and the Indignados movement, which was the 2011 uprising. So that morphed into what became Podemos, who then assumed the was the formerly Communist Party, as some sort of leftist alternative, as a means of trying to galvanise the energy created from the 2011 uprising.
So give us the anatomy of Podemos. Who are they? Would we recognise them here? To whom would we compare them here?
We would probably, they would be the equivalent of what is the Labour Party led by Corbyn.
So it's basically a Corbynista type
it pretends to be that. It tries to be that. What they don't have in Podemos is the backstabbers that they do have in the Labour Party here. Generally, there's a decent party support, but that's unhinged by the internal power struggles that the party has, which doesn't do the left any favours, because a lot of the right-wing press and, of course, the Conservative Party just sit back and watch while they have their little internal squabbles, which, again, delegitimises them as a credible political party.
Well, they had just a week or so ago a kind of leadership challenge. The leader rode that out. But is he fatally damaged by it?
No, I mean, that came about in the post-mortem of the fact that after the first round of elections in December 2015, Podemos won substantial votes, but then in the period between that and June 2016, lost votes, having got together with Izquierda Unida, or the United Left. It was forecast that they would actually become bigger than the Socialist Party.
But they went down.
But they went down, and so did the Socialist Party as well. People got tired, they got worried, insecure about what the kind of politics Podemos was trying to suggest. And in the end, this led to this kind of leadership crisis where Errejón said, well, maybe I can do things better. This is where we need to take it forward. And again, the media just pounced on this, and the right-wing governments just...
And was that a left-right split then?
Similar, yeah. I think Errejón felt that there needed to be more passionate leadership, and that Iglesias had kind of failed the party. But in the end, Iglesias was voted leader again in the recent meeting, and will take forward what seems to be a reduced number of party membership. I think the party membership has dropped like 50% in the last year. So it's quite serious.
Why haven't they broken through, given the fractured nature of the right and the economic devastation that austerity has brought to Spain?
I think that aside from the victory, which seemed to put them on course for becoming this sort of second largest party in Spain, the electorate got quite worried and bought into the affiliations with communism. They got concerned about the radical changes that Iglesias was proposing, because he challenged the Troika, he challenged Europe. He was proposing quite radical changes to the structure of working life, of the working week, to reduce it so that people were not abused by companies. And people, I think, got sceptical about whether that was possible. And that comes out in some of the interviews that we did in the book there, Riots and Political Protests, where the activists couldn't really come up with an alternative to capitalism. They're angry people. They didn't like the fact the country was immensely corrupt. But at the end of the day, when it came to an alternative,
they didn't seem to have one.
Not really.
You mentioned Europe. To what extent does the European Union play a role in Spanish politics and Podemos?
Europe very much has Spain by the collar, really, and that's not only linked to being part of the euro, but also the debt in which Spain is in to Europe. Because when the crisis came about, Spain very quickly borrowed 100 billion from Europe, of which it is still repaying. And this prompted the raping of the public services and the pension schemes and all this sort of thing. And that's another reason why people lost faith in the Socialist Party, because they were precisely the ones that instigated those very changes, as well as quite radical and drastic shifts to labour law.
Is Spain, therefore, still divided on civil war lines, with half the country scared of communism, scared of radical change, clinging to an old idea of Spain, and the other half furious about their disinheritance?
There's certainly that clash of identities, which looks to be more generational than anything else. But maybe it's the problem that it's still very young in its democratic roots, and so much has happened to it over the space of 40 years that it really has a kind of identity crisis in terms of its politics.
Well, it has an existential crisis too, because as someone who follows the course of separatist movements across the world, it seems to me that the movement around Barcelona and Catalan nationalism is possibly unstoppable, and therefore the Spain that we're talking about might not actually exist in the next few years.
It's possible, and I think that's another thing which undid Podemos in that respect, because they tried to align with these nationalist factions to gain more support. And a lot of people were worried that it might trigger referendums or something like this from the Basque Country or the Catalonians. And a lot of people certainly in Madrid don't want that, because Barcelona and the Catalan area is a massive financial hub. So if that was to separate, well, that would have dire financial consequences for the rest of the country.
Well, I think that's a point that many viewers need to grasp. The Catalonian nationalism is about living in a much smaller country that's very much more rich. And of course, the necessary consequence of that is that the rest of Spain becomes very much more poor. And that must be felt very keenly where you are in Madrid.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of worry, certainly among the electorate and people in Madrid, that with the potential severing of Barcelona, there could be major consequences for the rest of the country.
So what happens next? Is the government secure enough to limp on, or are we facing new elections?
I think we have to look at what is probably on the horizon in the UK and the United States to relate what is going to happen in Spain. The outlook looks very bleak. A quarter of young people are out of education, not in training, and not working. 30% of the population are at risk of falling into poverty. The rise in short-term contracts is ridiculous. In August last year, in Madrid, 80,000 short-term contracts were signed, of which 36,300 of those were for work for less than 6 days.
Wow.
Even in Leganés, which is a town just outside Madrid, when there was an advertisement for 500 jobs because a new commercial mall was opening, 20,000 applicants were queuing up to try and take those jobs.
And this explains the anger that you describe so well in your book. This indignado is a very powerful word, recognisable even here by English-speaking people. The indignation, the anger of young people in those circumstances must be palpable.
Totally. I mean, you're talking about a country which experiences an unparalleled level of corruption. It costs the government, I think, costs the economy each year something like 40,000 million euros. So it's immense. It's rife throughout the social and political structure, and there is a lot of anger. But again, we come back to the same thing. A lot of young people, although they're angry and upset about it, can't see an alternative, and that we have to partly place the blame at the left for trying to galvanise this energy.
No point in blaming the electorate. Dr. Daniel, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik.
Coming up next, the Russian Revolution, the days that shook the world. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. The February Revolution, March in our calendar, marked the beginning of the end of the old regime in Russia and set in motion the events of Red October, described by the American journalist John Reed as 10 days that shook the world.
Warren Beatty's film Reds may have been a box office disaster, much more serious than the events at the Oscars last week, but it will stand the test of time. But has the Russian Revolution?
Joining us to discuss just that is Professor Christopher Reed, no relation, from the History Department at the University of Warwick. Professor Reed, thanks for joining us. You specialise in the revolutionary period, so let me ask you about the February Revolution, March in our calendar. Just describe, if you would, what were the characteristics of that revolution? What did it look like? What were its demands? And how did the regime react to it?
Well, the really interesting things about the February Revolution are that you have kind of two levels to it. You have what you see and what you don't see. And in that sense, it's very like some of the revolutions we've had recently, the Arab Spring, the colour revolutions. There's a lot of action on the street. In Petrograd, there's a kind of escalation of demands from workers, from women, complaining that there's no food in the shops, there's no bread supplies. Workers are complaining about the conditions of work. And mysteriously, the biggest factory in Petrograd is actually shut down just a few days before the actual collapse of the autocracy. And 20,000 workers are thrown out onto the streets, and they begin to demonstrate. And that has led one school of thought to say the February Revolution was the most spontaneous of revolutions, that it unfolded from below. The people went onto the streets. A group of soldiers join in. They mutiny. They fire on the police. More soldiers join them, and the autocracy just collapses. Not quite so simple, because after all, it's only in one city that this is going on across a vast empire. There's 6 million troops at the front who could be involved. And actually, the element which I think is crucial is that behind the scenes, the people who emerge out of this as the new government are actually trying to stop that revolution from below. People don't expect the autocracy to collapse. They don't expect Nicholas's abdication to come quite so suddenly. After all, it's only in 1905 he'd survived over a year of titanic struggle. Here, in 2 weeks, he's gone. And that's because he's deserted by the generals. They've made a bit of a hash of certainly the first phase of the First World War. Easier to blame Nicholas than to blame themselves, so they blame him. And the elites are worried because if they see people on the streets demonstrating, where will it stop? They want the Tsar, they want the autocracy to maintain their privileges, to maintain their situation. It's threatening them. So they move in and they oppose him too. So Nicholas is left completely isolated.
So this Kerensky, who becomes briefly then the leader.
Yes.
Tell us about him.
Well, Kerensky is an interesting character too. He was a young man, only 36, 37 through 1917. He'd made his name as a lawyer defending the victims of Tsarism, and he was a very popular figure. He was a member of the Soviet, which was the kind of working class organisation that emerged in the revolution, and he was the only one who got permission of the Soviet to join the new government. And he was a man of the left, but of course the immediate problem they had was the German army on the doorstep. He didn't want to conduct a revolution while the German army was there, because the only outcome of such a series of events would be a German victory. And he rises up. He's initially Minister of Justice in February, saying, you must have somebody reliable to try the Tsar. My task is to try the Tsar as a criminal. He won't escape if I'm there. And the Soviet says, OK, we'll let you do that. He then becomes Minister of War, and then in July he becomes Prime Minister briefly. And
very briefly.
Yes, I mean, very briefly.
For someone like me who's
That's right.
an intimate of the Russian Revolution all of my life, Kerensky is a big name, and yet he was the leader only from July until October.
That's
it's
right.
an extraordinary short period of time.
Yes.
Could he have done anything to solidify that provisional government and stop what happened in October?
The complication there, of course, is that you have an attempted rebellion by the right, by the army, or by a section of the army under General Kornilov, whom Kerensky himself had appointed commander-in-chief. And it's really Kornilov's rebellion that opens the way to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks not a big force in July. In July, Lenin is saying, the situation's so bad we must abandon Soviets. We've lost control. They've become counter-revolutionary under Kerensky. We must go back to pre-1914. We must go back underground. And it looks very pessimistic. And in any case, at that stage, they probably would only have got 5 to 10% of the vote. But things are radically changed around at the end of August, early September, when Kornilov, supposedly attempting to ordered to shut down the Petrograd Soviet. Whether Kerensky ordered that or not is a matter of dispute now. But Kornilov certainly was heading for Petrograd to try to shut down the Soviet and possibly the provisional government, and to replace Kerensky with himself.
And might he have reinstated the Tsar?
Well, he would not have reinstated the Tsar. That's one of the problems. The autocracy, the monarchists in Russia had no candidate. Nicholas II was too weak. They didn't want to bring him back. Nobody wanted to bring him back. His successor, well, the Tsar, the Tsarevich was ill with his haemophilia. His brother had turned it down. The monarchists had nowhere to go. But what he did want to do was to introduce martial law in factories, on the railways, in other words, to try to shut down that social revolution which was developing all the time. And by splitting, I mean, Kerensky and Kornilov split over this. Kerensky turns against him, arrests Kornilov, and that leaves a power vacuum. And that's the power vacuum which, I mean, I think the rise of the Bolsheviks really is a matter of those last 8 to 10 weeks.
It is an extraordinary thing.
Yes.
There are decades when nothing happens and weeks
Suddenly,
when
exactly.
decades happen.
That's right.
The Bolsheviks very definitely did have a candidate, and they had a program distilled in 3 simple words: peace, land, bread.
Yes.
And by then, that's what the masses, not just in Petrograd, but across the country, were demanding. No?
Well, that's right. The problem arises that Lenin's understanding of those terms was different from the terms that the people had themselves. Lenin knew that if there was peace, there would be a civil war. So he knew that peace meant civil war. To think that you could actually improve the supply situation by a further revolutionary disruption was misleading or naive. And in fact, by spring of 1918, Lenin is saying, well, what idiot would have thought you could do that? And basically he was. And the land issue, they wanted to nationalize the land, and that was Bolshevik policy. But what they did was actually effectively to accede to the takeover which the peasants were themselves conducting. So it was Lenin has the credit of being the only leader, I think, in the political spectrum on the left who was prepared to go along with what the people themselves were doing. The idea of all power to the Soviets was something which came from deep in the popular movement as well. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which was when the revolution took place, the body to which power was taken, as it were, when they overthrew the provisional government, was already committed to all power to the Soviets, even when they were elected several weeks before. So they'd come to Petrograd specifically to decree all power to the Soviets. Of course, the irony of that is that, and the sadness and the tragedy of the October Revolution, in my view, that the first day of the seizure of power by the Soviets is the first day of the rapid decline of the Soviets. In 12 months down the line, the Soviets are so totally under the thumb of the Bolsheviks that they've lost popular representation.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to debate that point.
No, that
because
goes
I'd
a lot
like
further,
to
yes,
debate
yes.
it. But the key question, and I think if, with your permission, we'll bring you back in October to discuss the events of October. But the last question I've got time for now is, need the Bolsheviks have taken power? Could the provisional power have stabilized itself and kept basically a non-communist but revolutionary power going?
I'll give you a very simple, unacademic answer. No. I don't think they could.
They were doomed, do you think?
I think they were doomed, and that what people wanted was an all-party government of the left, including Mensheviks, SRs. A number of those were already in the provisional government. A government of national popular conciliation. They didn't want rights for the old ruling classes, particularly at this stage. They wanted the workers, peasants, soldiers, and if I was in charge of celebrations in Russia today, which is going to be very interesting to see how they celebrate, it would be that massive popular energy which comes out in 1917 that doesn't need parties. It throws up the leadership. They have their own agendas. They have their own organizations. They have factory committees. They have battleship committees. They have village committees. A tremendous amount of self-government and self-organization which is going on. And to me, that's what's so great about 1917. And it throws up a leadership in Lenin, which is partly sympathetic, but of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks have their own views as to where they should take the revolution. They're very much Bolshevik, they're very much utopians, they're idealists. They want to produce a sort of socialist caliphate. They want to produce this socialist utopia, which they know about, and try to persuade people. Whereas the ordinary workers and peasants, the peasants want the land, the workers want a better life, they want more representation, they want to work through the Soviets. It's a bit of a tragedy the way those two come together. But
let me book you now for October in our commemoration of Red October. Professor Reid, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So, the centenary of the Russian Revolution. Euroman, an activist, says, without the Russian Revolution in 1917, we would never get even this little democracy. It was important. And Roger the Dodger says, 1917 was the beginning of the end of communism.
Well, the first point is definitely true. It is now accepted by social democrats that social democracy only came into being in order to stop the so-called spread of communism. Whether communism died with the Russian Revolution, that would be a much more tricky intellectual proposition. Though I understand what's meant, and the professor, in a way, was making a similar
he was hinting
point.
at that, yeah. Well, that's all the tweets that we have time for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik or Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.